It is 30 minutes gone past 7 o'clock here on Smooth Breakfast. That means that we get to bring you news analysis for the next half hour on Freshly Pressed. I'm Sope Martins. This is Smooth Breakfast till 10 a.m. And joining me for the next half hour, I have got Ikemesit Effiong. You may know him as at Judge Ike up on social media. Ikemesit, good morning.
Hi, Shopper. Good morning.
Thank
Hello,
you.
Lagos. How are you?
We are wonderful. Well, we'll see. Let's take it to the news analysis and then we'll see. All right. People join the conversation. We're already streaming live up on youtube.com/smooth981 FM Lagos. When you get there, just leave your comments up on the live stream. And for those who are already there, welcome. You can also send WhatsApp messages in to +234 809 4440981 or take it to Twitter using the hashtag freshlypressed981 and tagging the handle at smooth981 FM. All right, now, Ikemesit, we're going to start off with really pertinent news for yesterday. This one comes in from the Punch newspaper, hashtag #EndSARS. Youths demand justice, police tear gas protesters. Um, Now, this is obviously remembering the victims 2 years after students, activists, lawyers, celebrities, and survivors of the shooting gathered at the Lekki toll gate on Thursday, singing solidarity songs and displaying placards. And then police at the scene used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse protesters. The protesters said that, or the people who gathered in remembrance said that they were met with violence from the police. But speaking on behalf of the police, we heard from the state police public relations officer Benjamin Hundeyin, who on his Twitter handle said only those who mounted the toll complex were dispersed, saying that they had resorted to lawlessness and so order had to be kept. Right, but it kind of said looking at both sides of the of both sides of the story, right? What would you say about the police response, even if we are going to go by the PRO, Benjamin Hyundai's statements? What about the optics of their response around such a sensitive issue? And then, furthermore, considering the fact that we're now 2 years on from the events that took place at the toll gates and from the um, origin protest, which was of people being taken, people being of forcibly taken, judicially killed. Have we seen any of the reforms that the protesters asked for? Have any of them been affected? I really just want to get your take on this.
The short answer to the second question is almost no. Okay, so let's talk about the police responses. Then we can talk about some of the longer term effects, right? Of NSAS. Their response was definitely top heavy. It was as though, just as you saw in the first anniversary to the protest, the security authorities in general were gunning for, or appeared to be gunning for, a confrontation. I know that typically with the rules of engagement when it comes to these things, you have to be prepared for every eventuality. But it was highly unlikely looking at the conversation that was happening on social media, for example, right, around NSAS, for the tone of what the tone and the approach to memorializing the event would be, that that it was going to be confrontational. And even Benjamin Hundeyin, the state police spokesperson, self-confessed himself that for the most part, this was a peaceful exercise. So there were probably ways in which,
by the way, Ikemesit, can we just highlight once again that the original protests were peaceful before they were disrupted?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So pretty much keeping in type with what went down in 2020 and also on the occasion of the first anniversary last year. And so this is where the conversation around how, how, what the effect of the security authorities inserting themselves into, a touchy but a peaceful and under control situation, right, often ends up being, right. That conversation is very relevant in looking at what happened in in Lekki yesterday. In terms of sort of the more longer term effects, right, of the NSAS. So we put out a graphic that actually went viral on Twitter yesterday, just trying to understand all of the various judicial panels of inquiry right across the country, people who got compensation, and just the general conversation, right, about how the country has managed the aftermath, right, of the protest and also wider fight to end police and state-sponsored brutality. You only had a situation where seven states refused to establish panels. Most states that did um, constitute panels of inquiry have concluded their sittings. But as I'm just looking at it now, six states, right, Kwara, Katsina, Bauchi, Taraba, Cross River, Enugu, and Anambra have not submitted panel reports. Kebbi, Sokoto, Zamfara, Kano, Jigawa, Yobe, and Borno didn't bother, right, to institute panels. Something like 219 million naira in compensation has been awarded for extrajudicial killings that were established. This is right across the country, right? That were established to have been carried out by state authorities. A further 52.5 million naira has been awarded as compensation for so-called enforced disappearances, 9 million naira as compensation for lawful arrest, and 27 million naira as compensation for unlawful detentions. In terms of the justice that has been meted out to officials of the state, primarily police officers, you have a situation where 15 police officers, you have a situation where 15 police officers across, and these numbers are national, right? Yeah. So they might look impressive until you think about the fact that these are actually national numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah. 15 police officers across the country have been recommended for disciplinary action, 28 recommended for prosecution, 25 recommended for dismissal, and only 4 policemen have lost their rank. And this is across 27 judicial panels of inquiry spread right across the country. It's clear that, I mean, even though baby steps have been made, a lot more could have been done in the intervening period. This is 24 months from October 2020. And it's not clear that the conversation is going to advance much further. We are in an election year. Interestingly, police brutality doesn't appear to be one of those live election issues that voters appear to be utilizing as a yardstick for how they assess the various candidates for office. And I'm not just talking about the president, but also the governorships as well as the legislative races. And so it almost appears as though Nigeria has entered that classic move on situation.
Do you
right
think
from
so?
this. And I think no, from an institutional standpoint,
Okay.
not necessarily in terms of keeping, the conversation live. And so in the end, it needs of us, right, to continue to make this a clear and a present conversation. And that's where the memorial that occurred yesterday, right, is very important and is very relevant. And from the police's reaction, it appears as though some lessons have still not been learned, right, from October 2020.
When will those lessons be learned? That is the question. Okay, let's take a look at your comments already coming in. Up on WhatsApp, Sir Kent says Nigerians who went to mourn loved ones who were killed for protesting police brutality were again tear gassed by the same police. We haven't grown. When will our uniformed men learn how to handle themselves? And I guess extrapolating from that, the people. This really is shameful, says Ken. MI from Akoka says, every time we want to give the Nigerian police force the benefit of doubt, they double down on showing us how incorrigible they still are. Goes on to say, thugs can lead marches in the states, but peaceful processions cannot be held by law-abiding citizens. Fela sang about sorrows, tears, and blood in 77. They thought he was just under the effects of drugs. Emeka from Ikeja says the police acted quite professionally. The destruction that was visited on Lagos was monumental. Lagos can never survive a repeat scenario. Must the protest be in Lekki? Must we recreate the circumstances before we draw the needful lessons? Interesting one. Every so-called peaceful protest has the potential to become violent, especially in a country like ours. Safety first. Emeka, what are you trying to say here? Okay. And D from Alausa says, the 2020 protests were initially peaceful at Lekki, but degenerated into mob attacks at other parts of Lagos and Nigeria. The protests of yesterday seems to have been getting rowdy before tear gas was used. It's a delicate situation, and more messages are coming in, but I will take it now to our next story of the day. Whatever happened, lives were lost, and we still need to remember those people. From the Daily Post, union workers will face sanctions for shutting down National Grid. This, according to the Minister of State for Power, Godwin Jedi Agba, who has disclosed that the committee that investigated the shutdown of the National Grid will submit a report by next week. Of course, we're referencing the workers who, under the National Union of Electricity Employees and Senior Staff Association of Electricity and Allied Companies, had shut down the National Grid over an industrial dispute back in August. And we remember the video with the turning of the key and how symbolic it was, and then the darkness. The darkness. We can never forget the darkness. But Ikemesit, now, and when that happened, a lot of people, the conversation around this was, okay, fine, what are we going to do about TCN? What are we going to do about the grid? But also, what are we going to do about these workers who very happily and very proudly showed us um, that they were capable of creating darkness just for their demands? What would you say about this, the Minister of State for Power's comments on this?
It's not often that I agree with it's not often that I agree with the minister, but I think I think it's clear that even for Nigerians who would ordinarily sympathize with um, the the travails of public sector workers who have been owed salaries and owed wages and do not exactly work right under the best employment conditions. For critical national infrastructure as the national grid, that there has to be other ways, right, of making yourself heard, right, while you are in the middle of an industrial dispute. The conversation at the time was that there were still several other levers of pressure that the National Union of Electricity Employees, as well as the Association of Electricity and Allied Companies, right, could have activated in order to make themselves heard and make their presence felt in the ongoing tit for tat that they've been having with the federal government over, the subject matter of their industrial disputes. Just going and flipping up switches, particularly at a time when, the country has suffered from what, 4 or 5 national grid collapses for supply
Officially?
reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Was what ultimately came across as irresponsible. And we all remember that viral video, right, of that senior union official that basically just stood browbeating, browbeating operators and, telling them to put off that switch and put it off and all of that stuff. It was really, it did not come out right. Right. Yeah. And so
Ikemesit was a giant middle finger to the nation.
It was right, yes, and so there have to be consequences for actions, right? The industrial dispute still persists, obviously. There are other ways, workouts, work slow mechanisms. I mean, there are creative ways. My operating theory with these things is that any striking public sector worker or any organization that's involved in an industrial dispute with the federal government should just go to France and learn some lessons in how to creatively protest against the government, because the French are very, very good at this. But I mean, flipping off switches, right, and endangering critical infrastructure, also endangering the lives, the economic well-being rights of Nigerians, right? just because you're arguing about money or conditions of service, it feels like a stretch too far. And I think
So it
sanctions
came and
are
said, real
appropriate.
quick, I want to just put this. I want to see if we can put this in a visual, and I want you to tell me if this is what we're looking at here. Is it akin to, let's say, if nurses decide to go on strike, turning off the drip to the patients?
I mean, it almost feels that way, right? Yeah. So, I mean, but we've had this argument, right, with respect to medical officers and employees as to, where are the lines of morality and ethics, right? I mean, oftentimes how medicine, how doctors, how nurses, how associated medical workers have managed that is really just to crank down the speed at which services are delivered, right? To the point where there is a palpable effect, right? But you don't turn off, life support, or you don't withdraw critical care, right? Yeah, for example, I mean, there's some clear gray lines with respect to electricity employees. With the flip switching, it was clear that all lines had been crossed, and that there have to be appropriate sanctions for this. So I'm on the money with the minister and with the House of Representatives, I think, on this
one. Okay, then. Let's take a look at this next article in from the Punch newspaper. Kanu of flight risk. Federal government tells Supreme Court they filed 7 grounds of appeal against the October 13th Court of Appeal judgments, which discharged the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, Nnamdi Kanu. The federal government asked the Supreme Court to set aside the judgments and restore the charge against the respondent to be tried at the trial court, stating, let me put this in, and I quote, there was no evidence led by this respondent before the court of the first instance, and indeed before the court below, to show how he was allegedly abducted and rendered to Nigeria, as required by Section 139 of the Evidence Act 2011, since he alleged that he was abducted without following due process of the law. Ikemesit, I'm coming to you.
Okay, so to that narrow point, before we pan out and talk a bit about how this appeal is likely to go and really where Nnamdi Kanu goes from here. I think that particular statement that you just quoted was the federal government being very creative, right, in how it interpreted the proceedings at the Court of Appeal. The fact of the matter remains that it was the court who asked the government team how someone who, right, I mean, and Nnamdi Kanu jumped his bill, let's be clear. John Bill left the country, right? That happened. Right. But the court asked the federal government how they secured his attendance at the trial. And the DSS said on multiple occasions, right, that it was not at liberty to state, right? So the burden of proof did not necessarily lie with Nnamdi Kanu's team to prove those circumstances, right? But it was pretty clear that since the government could not explain how it got the attendance for the prosecution, then it probably must have been procured, right, by legal means. Having said that, it's not surprised that this appeal happened. When we discussed, last Thursday's judgment, right, last Friday, I told you that the taste of the pudding was going to be in the eating and whether the federal government was going to release Nnamdi Kanu, which I said was highly unlikely. You are now seeing with this effort that the federal government is determined, right, to hold on to Nnamdi Kanu. And the federal government's argument, to be clear, is not all hogwash. I mean, a lot of it makes sense. Nnamdi Kanu is a dual British Nigerian national. He is certainly, a flight risk in the traditional construction of, how criminal prosecutions, right, of this nature go. Generally, courts are very reticent to allow people who hold additional passports to Nigerian passports, right, to in effect, just attend trial on their own recognizance, trusting that they will show up in court, right, every day. I mean, Nigerians who do not have second passports but have visas, right, have been known to abscond their trials. And so this appeal, it really was a matter of when and not if it was going to happen. I suppose where a lot of the quarrel with the federal government has been is in the fact that they should have allowed, Nnamdi Kanu be freed, because there was a clear order of court from the Court of Appeal requiring that while this appeal happened. But now that the federal government has filed the appeal, there are legal mechanisms that allow the federal government to still hold on, right, to the accused person, or at least still keeping him in custody while that particular appeal is being happened. And I should point this out, and this is the final intervention that I'll make on this particular issue. The substance of the criminal trial, right? The charges of treasonable felony, of conspiracy to commit felony, of terrorism and aiding and abetting and supporting terrorism, those have not been attended yet. Those have not been attended to yet at the Federal High Court. So you now have an appeal that has come through the Court of Appeal, is now at the Supreme Court, just on the matter of how Nnamdi Kanu skipped bail and he was brought back to Nigeria, and he was brought back to court. After this matter has been trashed out, we still have to go back and deal with the substance of the criminal allegation. So
wow, this is not going away anytime
soon. His legal and judicial travails still have some way to run.
All right. Let's look at the messages and then we'll go on to the next story. So this message comes in from Tayo, who says, darkness, you say. Some of us are already used to the dark. We don't mind. But now they want to punish workers for working below par, as though that would change anything. This one in from Dami from Ikeja, who says, the French destroyed 60% of traffic cameras in the country when speed limits were reduced in 2019. Lesson learned. Idima Puza from Surulere says,
I do not think you should go and learn that too.
Ijima Puza from Surulere says, it's only in Nigeria that people do wrong things and go scot-free without consequences, switching off the national grid at will, oil thefts, etc. This one comes in from Joseph from Silver Estate, who says, looks like the government hasn't learned anything regarding the NSARS issue. But if only they could be proactive, then we wouldn't be having clashes back and forth. He goes on to say a political party had their campaign on Sunday, which was insensitive to residents. Many fell victim to it, but police did nothing. And yesterday, they tear gassed a memorial gathering. Oh, wow, Joseph. All right, I see where you're going with this one. Let's take a look at the nation news now. Buhari fires NDDC sole administrator. This one is quite a short one, but just saying that the president has sacked the sole administrator of the Niger Delta Development Commission, Effiong Akwa. Let me hear from you on this, Ikemesit.
Yeah, a really short one. The NDDC has been cycling through a leadership crisis, right? The last director general, but rather since the last managing director, right, Sima Ekere was booted out of office. We all remember the very public spat that the Minister of Niger Delta Affairs, Godswill Akpabio, and the head of a particular panel which was instituted, I think, by the National Assembly, if I recall, to probe the finances of the NDDC. I can't quite recall the lady's name right now, but there was a very public spat, and Godswill Akpabio made it his political remit to undermine the investigation into the NDDC's affairs. The presidency had to step in, basically sacked the entire board of the NDDC. The NDDC has been rudderless from a leadership standpoint pretty much since mid-2021, right, when all of this went down. And so, this is just yet another development in what now seems to be a low-grade saga, right, over at one of the federal government agencies that sits on one of the biggest piles of cash and development and intervention funding, right, in the country. So let's not think that this story is just a story about just one out-of-the-way agency without any significant consequence. The NDDC is a very rich and a very influential agency, and really,
that's meant to be doing very good work for the region that we have not yet seen.
Well, depending on who you ask, right? But the NDDC's track record is very mixed on a host of indicators, right? So this is worth watching. This is not a rounding This is not one of those rounding error political sagas. This is a very important thing to actually look at closely, especially in the lead up to the elections. And organizations like the NDC have been known in the past, right, to reorient their interventions, right, to further the political ambitions of incumbents. And so, yeah, file this under keeping view, right? I think is the object. Yes.
All right. And Tony says, please educate us. ASU was asked to respect court orders before their appeal would be heard, but the federal government is not obligated to do the same whilst appealing against Kanu. Why? Tony asks. All right. Moving on now. Let's see. This next one comes in from the Daily Trust. Senators kick as police trust fund spends 550 million naira on renovation and furniture. So the committee is investigating 252 agencies over the spending of 5 trillion naira from the service-wide votes between 2017 and 2021. And the members were shocked when they discovered in a document submitted by the management team of the Police Trust Fund, which appeared before the Senate panel yesterday, to explain how this sum was spent. And they were particularly galled by the sum of 550 million naira spent on office renovation and furniture. Ikemesit.
Yeah, so this is a very important story, right? So the first thing is to explain what is going on. So right now, the Senate Public Accounts Committee, one of the most powerful committees in the Senate, is investigating how, like you said, 252 agencies spent, get this, 5 trillion naira in service-wide votes between 2017 and 2021. As a matter of fact, let me give the Police Trust Fund some props because they showed up before the panel. Earlier this week, on Tuesday, 14 agencies, including, and I want to get this right, including the Budget Office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Defense Headquarters, and the Asset Management Company of Nigeria, refused to appear before this panel to account for how they have utilized their service-wide votes. Now, what's a service-wide vote? A service-wide vote, which is also known as a consolidated revenue fund, is more or less the country's contingency fund, right, which is embedded in the annual. So think of it as the miscellaneous item, right, on a budget sheet that you would create. It's for, unforeseen, hard to predict expenses. It's typically domiciled with the Federal Ministry of Finance, but it is made in the name of, responsible agencies. And so what the Finance Ministry basically does is that every year, it basically tells the National Assembly, okay, this is what the service-wide vote quota or mark for a given agency, right, would be. Now, what the Senate panel, and this is, this is something that's little known, right, that's not very well known, right, by many Nigerians, right, and basically these agencies have the administrative fiat to use this service-wide votes however they see fit, right? And so what the Public Accounts Committee has been doing is basically to ask agencies to account for this. When a budgeting cycle, the president presented the 2023 budget a little over 3 weeks ago. So the Senate and the National Assembly in general, but the Senate and the House of Representatives, right, are very much in fiscal responsibility mode, right? And the National Assembly has oversight function over the executive, amongst other things, utilizes public money, right? Basically, what the Police Trust Fund said was that they had acquired an office building that had been confiscated by the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. It required some renovation, and so they utilized these monies to basically do things like acquire furniture and equipment, renovate and partition, as well as, rehabilitate. And if you actually read the story, they put a top line breakdown, right, of what each of those bucket line items cost. The committee was, like you said, shocked. And the chairman of the committee has actually asked the Police Trust Fund to furnish the committee with all relevant documentation that evidences spending along the line items they said, as well as, getting their procurement officer to appear before the committee next week. So yes, there are important questions that the Police Trust Fund should answer with respect to this, but at least they showed up before the panel. The other agencies that are boycotting and actively acting like this committee does not exist is the bigger story, I suppose. And this is something that, again, file under keeping view, Nigerians should be closely watching. Our budget deficit is going to hit 10 trillion naira. The government is thinking about selling national assets. Nigeria has been borrowing year on year. There's been an increase, right, in our borrowing limit. The finance minister is talking about, but insisting that she did not say that the country wants to vary the tenure of its bonds. And so when it comes to fiscal accountability, Nigerians need to pay a lot more attention to how public monies are being spent. And this is an important way and an important starting point, right, in that regard.
All right, then. Ikemesit F. Young, thank you so much for joining me for Freshly Pressed this Friday morning. You can find him at Judge Ike up on Twitter, up on social media. We've tweeted from our handle his reference towards the charts that SPM Intelligence tweeted that went viral. So go ahead and find it and him on our handle at Smooth981 FM. Ikemesit, I look forward to having another conversation, robust as it is, with you next week. Till then, have a wonderful